The story of tomatoes, cannibalism, and pizza. You heard me right. It all has to do with tomatoes, from cannibalism to pizza. Where does the story start? Well, there was a gentleman called Hernando Cortés who went to a place called Mexico and conquered it. And as they were conquering it, they were fighting some incredibly powerful warriors called the Aztecs. And the Aztecs had a little strange tradition. When they captured you, they would actually sacrifice you to the gods, taking out your hearts, offering it to the gods, and then they would take the rest of you and eat it. This was actually even described by one of the conquerors, a guy called Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who said that the Aztec warriors were so sure that they would win against the intruders or the Spaniards that they had already pots ready with chilies and something called tomatoes, ready to get them, to slaughter them, and to cook them. So the first contact between the West and the tomato happens in a place called Mexico. Of course, for the last decades, we've had a huge conversation going on. Is it tomato or tomato?
You like tomato, and I like tomato. Tomato, tomato, oh, let's call the whole thing off.
Well, the original name that we came to know the tomato by is tomatl, from the Aztec language Nahuatl. As a matter of fact, they had two kinds of tomatoes when the Spaniards arrived. They had tomatl and jitomatl. Funny enough, this is a tomatl and this is a jitomatl. By some strange coincidence, the original tomatl, which is green as you can see, and the jitomatl, which in Nahuatl was the red one, were then confused, and nowadays we know this one by tomato, the red one. And in case you're wondering what tomatl means in the original Nahuatl Aztec language, it means swelling fruit or fat water. But that's not even where the tomato story starts. The original tomatoes are found in Peru and Ecuador in some valleys that lead into the Andes. And initially what they were, little cherry-sized tomatoes this size, which nowadays have become cherry or cocktail tomatoes, rather chic. The fact is that the original tomatoes are even smaller than this. And as far as we understand, the original color would have been a bit more yellowish, greenish, and then they started breeding it into a red color. As the tomato arrived in Europe with the Spaniards, initially people did not quite know what to do with this. It was new to them, it looked rather nice, but was it edible? And the funny thing is that people realized that the tomato is actually a nightshade. And nightshades, like mandrakes, were poisonous, and that's what the people knew. Now, of course, the tomato is not poisonous, the stem and the leaves are poisonous, but the people came to the correct conclusion it's a nightshade, and the only nightshades they knew were all poisonous. This was before tomatoes and, for example, bell peppers came in. So people were looking at this, and they initially only used them for decorative purposes. So they grew them in their gardens, go, how beautiful is this? Until slowly but surely the word got through, this is actually edible. So the next fun thing happened. As the people started eating the tomatoes, there was a rich-poor divide. And the funny thing is that for a long time, tomato was food for the poor. How come? Very simple. Because the wealthy, they could afford pewter plates. Nice, gorgeous pewter plates. The poor did not have money for pewter, and they had to eat off wooden plates. Now the difference is, tomato has some acid in it. And what acid does, it leaches out the lead in the pewter plates, and thus it becomes toxic for consumption. The poor had the wooden plates, and of course there is no lead in the wooden plate. And hence the rich were like, this stuff is no good for you. And the poor happily continued eating them. The acceptance of the tomato, culturally and also for food, was much higher in the south, like Italy, moving slowly to the north. For example, in Germany, the tomato was known as Wolfspfirsich, which is wolf's peach. Why? Because other nightshades were supposed to be able to summon werewolves. And so this was as round as a peach. And again, because it was a nightshade, it might attract werewolves. Over time, of course, the word got through that this could be eaten. And by now, in the 1950s and 60s, it had changed so much, and from being the evil, wolf-attracting or werewolf-attracting fruit of evil, it ended up being called, for example, in Austria, Paradeiser, which literally means the apple of paradise. The tomato became almost an overnight success globally. Together with chili, they became the fastest spreading plant varieties in the world, influencing cuisines everywhere they went. It was so fast that even in the 16th century, the tomato is already mentioned in Nepalese cuisine. Which now brings us to the famous pizza. Where does pizza come from? Well, the story goes that in 1880, Queen Marguerite of Italy came to visit Naples in Italy. And one local baker wanted to make a national dish. So he took a piece of flat bread and he took the three colors of Italy. Red from tomatoes, white mozzarella, and the green leaves of basil to create the red, white, and green of Italy. And this is why the pizza is also called Margarita. Tomatoes are so powerful that they can create Hollywood careers. What am I talking about? I'm talking about George Clooney, sexiest man alive. The first breakthrough role he ever had was in a movie called The Return of the Killer Tomatoes, 1988's follow-up sequel to 1977's schlock wonder hit, The Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. For those of you who cannot get enough of tomatoes, there is one place you need to visit. It's a town of Buñol in Spain, where once a year they've got the feast of La Tomatina. La Tomatina happens every last Wednesday in August. What happens is that a bunch of people get together and start throwing tomatoes at each other. Roughly 140, 150,000 kilos of tomatoes being thrown. It takes about an hour and a half. It all started in 1946 when a few young guys were not happy with some procession through town and they threw tomatoes at each other. And then it grew and grew and grew until now it's an international phenomenon. So popular that you actually have to buy entrance tickets to be able to also throw tomatoes around for an hour and a half. Cool side effect about this is that, remember, tomatoes have got acid. After the throwing ends and they scrub down all the city streets, they become super clean for the rest of the year. And nowadays, we cannot even imagine a world without tomatoes. A story that began with two cherry-sized, beautiful little fruits in the valleys of Peru and Ecuador. The global market annually in tomatoes is worth $190 billion. Here's a challenge for you guys. Tell us which other fruits, plants, vegetables, trees that changed world history you would like us to make one of the videos about. Just put it down below in the comments and we'll get working straight away. Like, subscribe, and share.